Look closely at a physical book. Before it conveys a plot or a philosophy, it is a physical collision of materials, liquid ink bleeding into the dried fibers of paper. We hold this object and assume we know exactly where it starts. We tend to conceptualize literary creation through a clean, linear sequence. We imagine an idea forming in the author's mind, translating directly into the first written word on the page, and traveling in a straight line to the reader's first encounter with the text. This clean trajectory collapses when we examine the actual mechanics of textual creation. The beginning functions as a shifting intersection of competing variables: the author's physical production, the conceptual germination of the story, the materiality of the printed page, and the active engagement of the reader. Writers know this. Rather than providing a clean starting line, authors actively engineer their text to dodge, delay, and displace their own origins. To understand how this works, we have to examine the physical mechanics of the page, map the structural boundaries writers build around their stories, and break down the deeply held myths we have about the act of reading itself. Treating the first word of a novel as its singular point of origin is a theoretical trap. It blinds us to the actual mechanics of how literature functions. The easiest place to see this instability is right at the physical boundary of the text. The first word on the page rarely aligns with the narrative's inception. Take John Milton's 1667 epic, Paradise Lost. Milton set out with an immense ambition to document the absolute initial start of human history, the fall of Adam and Eve. But look at the actual opening lines he printed on the page. Milton immediately introduces a structural problem. He spends the opening of the text invoking a heavenly muse, asking this divine entity for the inspiration required to compose the poem. This creates a closed temporal loop. Inspiration arrives after the poem has already commenced on the paper. He compounds this through syntax. The grammar isolates the main verb, sing, burying it deep in the sixth line. By holding back that primary verb, Milton actively suspends the narrative action. The text is physically moving forward, but the grammatical engine of the sentence hasn't even started. The ink has hit the page, but the action is deferred. The physical start of the book actively displaces its own grammatical beginning. If Milton displaces the start by delaying it, other authors challenge the origin point by using the classical strategy of in medias res, dropping the readers straight into the middle. Dante's The Divine Comedy famously opens with the bewildered narrator abruptly waking up completely lost in a dark wood. This diagram maps Dante's problem. He confronts the reader with three simultaneous middles: the middle of a human life, a physical journey through the woods, and the text's narrative structure. No narrative exists in a vacuum. The story has already begun. Laurence Sterne attacks this same problem from the opposite direction in his 1759 comedic novel, Tristram, Shandy. Sterne attempts to locate an absolute beginning by starting his autobiography at the exact moment of his protagonist's biological conception. But Sterne immediately hits a roadblock. Conception doesn't happen in isolation. It is determined by prior contexts, like the parent's state of mind, which requires explaining their day, and the day before that. Sterne isolates the temporal paradox of writing. Writing about a life takes significantly longer than living it. A strict sequential narrative will infinitely lag behind the subject it is trying to capture. Epic middling or comedic regression, the result is identical. These case studies prove narrative timelines are structurally incapable of capturing their own genesis. If the first narrative word is so unreliable, we have to zoom out. Where does the actual physical boundary of a book lie? In 1987, literary theorist Gerard Genette provided a framework for this by identifying what he called peritexts. Genette mapped the peritext as a series of structural defenses. Titles, epigraphs, dedications, and prefaces are distinct architectural elements that surround the main body of work. They multiply the text's beginnings, forcing the reader to cross multiple thresholds. Sometimes these function as literal barriers. Mark Twain halts the reader before Huckleberry Finn even starts with an official notice from the chief of ordnance, threatening to shoot anyone attempting to find a moral in the plot. Herman Melville buries the reader under layers of peritextual debris. Before you ever reach the famous line, "Call me Ishmael," Moby Dick forces you through a dedication, a sprawling etymology of the word Wadel, and pages of historical extracts. Virginia Woolf utilizes contents pages, prefaces, and illustrations in Orlando to establish an equivocation on the protagonist's gender identity, long before the narrative technically starts. Even when a reader breaches these outer walls, the opening line itself can act as a peritextual trap. Jane Austen opens Pride and Prejudice by boldly proclaiming a truth universally acknowledged. She establishes a tone of objective universalism, only to immediately undercut it with strict, localized satire about wealthy men needing wives. Paratexts operate as both entrances and barricades. They mediate our arrival, constantly pushing the true starting line further and further away from the reader's grasp. To see all of these displacement strategies operating simultaneously, we can look at T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. This network graph maps Eliot's paratextual hurdles. He fragments the origin point across history. The title anchors to post-1918 Europe. Epigraphs yank the context to Petronius. The dedication quotes Dante, and the famous first line is simply a pastiche of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. This is the precise definition of intertextuality. Every phrase relies on the context of prior writings to generate meaning. The theorist Roland Barthes formulated this by stating that every text is simply a new tissue of past citations. Under this framework, a writer operating in total isolation is impossible. To invent a truly original text from scratch, an author would have to invent an entirely new language, completely devoid of historical or cultural references. Every single literary work is constructed from the displaced fragments of prior texts. Originality is a persistent illusion. Despite this evidence, society still clings to the idea of a stable beginning. We do this by relying on two deeply ingrained critical myths. The first myth is embedded in that clean, linear communication model we started with. It is known in literary theory as the intentional fallacy. The fallacy is the assumption that a text begins as a coherent, finalized thought inside the author's brain, and that the text's meaning is anchored solely to whatever the author intended. We have zero empirical access to the conscious or unconscious thoughts of a writer. We do not possess their intent. We only possess the physical, material reality of the text printed on the page. Because we cannot extract meaning directly from the author's mind, we cannot anchor the origin of the text to them. The text remains adrift. The second myth anchors the origin to the audience through the myth of the first reading. Roland Barthes argues that the idea of a primary, naive reading experience is a fiction. He posits that every act of reading is actually an act of rereading. When you pick up a book for the very first time, your reaction is already pre-programmed by your culture, your ideological habits, and the structure of every other story you have ever consumed. As Eliot noted, reading critically is inevitable as breathing. You cannot turn off your prior knowledge. Reading The Wasteland without recognizing the references to Chaucer or Dante, the text remains closed. To accurately read the poem, you must actively reread prior texts through Eliot's exact words. This forces us to replace the linear timeline with a topological model. The author, text, and reader do not operate in sequence. They exist in a continuous, non-linear feedback loop. The study of literature is the investigation of uncertain origins. Each beginning serves as an intersection where author, reader, and history endlessly displace one another.